For these tips and techniques for making your MIDI mockups pop, I will be working in Logic, though the concepts I'm going to be walking through apply across the board if you're in Digital Performer, Pro Tools, Cubase, Ableton Live, or another DAW. These concepts apply. Now when it comes to setting up templates, the first thing you'll want to do is set yourself up to be as efficient as possible. When you have a tight project deadline, there is no time to waste, as you know. So before we set up our template, I want to take a moment to discuss multi-timbral instruments. If you're using Kontakt or another multi-timbral virtual instrument, you may want to load up multiple instruments into one instance of the plugin. This has its benefits, that your computer will run your session more efficiently, taking less CPU power, and it has its drawbacks, that you have less control over mixing, effects, and automation of your individual instruments. This is because all the instruments play through one audio source, which runs through the same effects at the same volume level using the same panning. You can alter this by routing each of these MIDI instruments to their own audio tracks, which solves the problem, but then you have one MIDI track and one aux track for each instrument, which can get messy. I find that running each instrument through their own instance of Kontakt does not noticeably slow down my computer. It's easier to set up, easier to organize, easier to mix. Check, check, and check. The only drawback is that it takes a bit longer to load the session each time. Now I'm sure many people disagree, but every composer works their own way. I'll show you how to set up Kontakt as a multi-timbral instrument, but then for the remainder of the lesson, I will use a template with individual instances of Kontakt. So to set up Kontakt as a multi-timbral instrument, we're going to create a new track, check, multi-timbral, and we can have up to 16 MIDI tracks routed into that Kontakt instrument, and click Create. So here they are. I'm going to delete this other one so we don't get confused. Now when I load up Kontakt onto that track, and of course I'm using Kontakt, but this can be any multi-timbral instrument. I'm going to load up an instance of this instrument that has 16 separate stereo outputs. Okay. Now you'll notice that each one of these instrument tracks is routed to the same place. They're all routed to instrument 2, MIDI channel 1, MIDI channel 2, MIDI channel 3, and so on. So these 16 MIDI tracks are all routed to the same location, just on different MIDI channels. So now I can load up my instance of Kontakt with whatever instruments I want to. And I will just do a string section. I'll have violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, bass. Now, the first 5 tracks are routed to those 5 destinations inside Kontakt. My violin is receiving on MIDI channel 1, violin 2 is receiving on MIDI channel 2, viola is receiving on MIDI channel 3, and so on. So what I'm going to do is rename my tracks. Violin 1, 2, viola, cello, and bass. And again, to clear up confusion, I'm just going to delete these tracks so we know exactly what we're looking at. So this is all well and good. I can sequence MIDI on these tracks and it would work. The tricky thing though is what I was mentioning earlier, that each of these are going to the same audio source. So what I need to do in Kontakt is this option right here in the Outputs, Batch Functions, Clear Output section, and create one individual channel for each loaded instrument. When I do this, it will give me 5 new stereo aux channels built right into Kontakt here. So each of these tracks now are outputting on separate stereo outputs. So to capture those in Logic, I have to hit this plus button here on that instrument track. And every time I hit it, it creates a new auxiliary track. This one receiving on contact 3 and 4, this one receiving on contact 5 and 6, and so on. And then you would name these aux tracks. Actually, violin 1 audio is going to output on the original instrument track. And then violin 2 would output on this first aux, viola, cello, bass. So this is how you set that up. I don't like to work this way because of what I was mentioning earlier. You have 2 separate tracks for each instrument, which gets really messy. I find it difficult to keep track for mixing and for automation and all of that stuff. And again, I don't find it slows my computer down too much to have a new instance for each of these instruments. So let's move on from this and let's set up our template. So first thing when it comes to setting up a template is to create your tracks. One thing I like to do here in Logic is just duplicate this track a bunch of times using Command D. So I've got I'll do 30 software instrument tracks. Then you want to name your tracks, and perhaps you want to go with a standard orchestral setup, or maybe you have some specific orchestral instrumentation that you're using for a piece. I'm going to say flute 1, flute 2, and so on. So here are my tracks named, and I find this phenomenally helpful to have this in orchestral order. Woodwinds on top, moving to brass, moving to percussion, moving to strings. And I like to color coordinate these. In Logic, the way you can do that is select your tracks, right click, and there's an option for assign track color. And that's very helpful just as a visual reference. You can go one step further and group these tracks together into what's called a track stack, and different DAWs call these different things. In Logic, you can create a track stack, and there's 2 different options, a folder stack or a summing stack. A folder just lets you lump them all together and minimize them. A summing stack actually gives you an audio track where you can put effects that apply to all of those tracks. I'm just going to create a folder stack, and I can call this Woodwinds, and I can minimize them or maximize them as necessary. That can be really helpful to just shrink things down so that you can see things very clearly. Then the next thing you'll want to do is instantiate all your instruments. Instantiate is just a fancy term for load up your instruments. If your tracks are all using the same virtual instrument, you can instantiate them together by selecting all of them and loading them up here. And for this workflow, I'll create an instance of Contact that just has a stereo output, since I'm not going to be using multiple MIDI instruments in the same Contact instance. So that loads Contact up to every instrument track, and then you can go through the tedious process of loading up your instrument for each track, which I won't bore you with here. Now, before you save your template, I would recommend setting up some auxiliary tracks for reverb. A great way to run reverb is to set up sends from every single track through a bus captured by an auxiliary track that has the reverb on that track. The benefit to doing it that way is that every single track is using the same reverb, which saves on CPU, and it gives your mix more clarity and less muddiness to all be using the same reverb. If you had different reverbs on all your tracks, it could get very muddy very quickly. So I'll select all of these tracks, go to the send assignment, send them out through any old bus. Choose bus 1. In Logic, that automatically creates an auxiliary track. Though if I wanted to do that manually, I could create a new auxiliary track channel strip right here. So they're all routed out through bus 1 into this auxiliary track that's receiving on bus 1, and then I will instantiate a reverb plugin onto that track. When you set it up this way, you want to make sure that the dry reverb amount is all the way down and the wet processed reverb is at 0 dB or at unity gain. And the reason why is because the tracks themselves are going to be played dry, straight to the output. So this reverb track, we only want to hear reverb on that. We don't want to hear any more of the dry signal. And then you can control the overall reverb amount with the volume slider on the aux track. Before you save your template, you could instantiate any other plugins that you want to use. If you know you're going to be using compression and EQ on your strings tracks or whatever, you can load those up and then you're good to go. You can, in Logic, you go to the File menu and Save as Template. And I could call this Orchestral Template or something more specific if I like. Save. Now when I go to create a new document, I can say New from Template. And if I go to My Templates, this is the template I just created, so I can load that up. If you were working in a DAW that doesn't have that feature, then I would suggest setting all this up and just save it as a session file on your computer, and then when you want to use that template, load it up and then immediately do a save as, so that you're not editing the original one. You're creating a copy of it and you're working off of the copy.